Hello there, this is Bobby again, and in this one we're going to talk about end times stuff and millennialisms, I'm going to call it. So I don't really advertise these things. I already don't have hardly any subscribers. So, but anyways, this will be up on my channel. So I'm going to do this live. I'm trying to use a StreamYard thing here, and I really don't know how it works exactly. So I should also make this interesting and kind of like an experiment. But so, um, yeah, so let's get into this and um, talk about a topic that is is on a lot of people's minds, especially just with this most recent back and forth, so to speak, because that's an understatement, between this mini war kind of between Israel and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Um, so in the American mind, that for a lot of Americans, at least of a certain demographic, maybe like from Gen X and older, for a lot of that, the whole Israeli conflict with the Palestinians um, is something that conjures up a lot of memories, especially if we've grown up in the evangelical world. So we have the late great Planet Earth with Hal Lindsey. Of course, that takes us back to it takes somebody like me back to my parents' generation with when his book came out originally, and then more my uh, generation. Although I was out of high school really when the Left Behind series. I was in college, Bible college actually, when those came out. The Left Behind series by Jenkins and Tim LaHaye. Those really made kind of like a splash in the world. Of course, they made the movies and the popular movies and about the that and the whole scenario that's painted there. So that's where I grew up as well, and that theology, just like a lot of us did as evangelicals, with the dispensationalism, premillennial, pre-tribulational rapture theology, so to speak, where the nation of Israel and um, the church are considered distinct people of God. That was that was the way I was taught to think about how to understand that relationship, as like maybe we approach that in Romans 9 through 11, for example. We get that kind of discussion about the church in Israel. So as dispensationalists, the hallmark of dispensationalism is that they see a distinction or a discontinuity between Israel and the church as two people of God, and that God's primary people, his covenant people, are the ethnic nation of Israel, and that all of his prophetic plans and all the prophecies in the Old Testament really have to do with Israel and national Israel. And so the nation of Israel coming back together in 1948, being reestablished as a state, is very significant. It's a very significant event for dispensational Christians. And so that is considered the proof for dispensationalists who are teaching that a dispensational doctrine today, that what they're teaching is the truth, and that Israel, they'll refer to something like Isaiah 11, where it talks about Israel coming back together again a second time. Um, so that's really a key text for them. It was one that even the former president of my Bible college at Multnomah, which they called mini, they used to call mini Dallas Theological Seminary because it had a relationship to Dallas. And Dallas Theological Seminary is has been and is still, I think, the primary seminary in the country in America that has promoted dispensational theology. Louis Sperry Schaefer, like the founder of Dallas Theological Seminary, was a very prominent dispensational teacher, prophecy teacher, and of course he did other stuff. He has a systematic theology he wrote, but it's all shaped by this dispensational hermeneutic. Of course, you have before him C.I. Scofield, John Nelson Darby, who really founded dispensationalism and pre-tribulational thinking about the rapture and all of that kind of stuff, which really all this started in the UK, and then it got really popularized here in the United States. So, and you can read about that by a guy named Ernest Sandine. I forget the title of his book now, but it's a really helpful book as far as understanding the history of millenarianism in America and the UK and how that developed. And so I maybe in the little notes later in my under my video here, I'll share the title of that book. And so you can see what I'm talking about as far as how dispensationalism developed originally and how it was popularized. Also, another good author on that is George Marsden, and he focuses primarily on the American context and how dispensational thinking really took off here as part of the broader phenomenon of American fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism. And those two were tied together, and it took off. And there were prophecy conferences that were big, and not prophecy in the sense of like when we think of like TBN, the Trinity Broadcasting Network with Paul and Jan Crouch and the Word Faith movement, not prophecy in that sense, but prophecy as far as like biblical prophecy and what the prophets spoke of about the nation of Israel, and the way that dispensationalists understand that in a very literalistic sense. And so that's what shaped has shaped a lot of American evangelicalism. So I wanted to read from, let's see here, if I can find the passage. See, I'm doing all of this on the fly, and I'm actually really tired, so I don't know why I'm doing this other than I'm bored, and I need to take a nap actually, but I'm kind of like so tired I can't sleep, which is weird. So maybe I'll wear myself out by doing this little live thing here. And I'm also trying the StreamYard in case you just started watching me. So it's supposed to help me organize my broadcast here. I want to bring in, it looks like I can bring in like stuff from online, like have a split screen, show my mug and like text or whatever I want to pull up next to me. But I don't know. I'm experimenting with this too. So let's see. So I just clicked on that, but I don't know how that works yet, unfortunately. Because I wrote a blog post at another blog I have that I've had for a long time too. I don't really use it though, but it was gonna be dedicated to this kind of topic because in the American context, this topic is like pertinent. Like I have friends in the UK, and especially on the academic side, and they don't even understand like why I'm so interested in this. Like why would I even talk about this? And most of them are just agnostic when it comes to this kind of discussion, anyways. So I don't really that doesn't really when they don't show any interest in this kind of stuff, I'm like, okay, whatever. I mean, most of them don't even have a view actually on biblical end times type stuff. And even though the Bible talks about it frequently, and not just in the theological dogmatic sense of eschatology, which is important, and how that relates to protology and apocalyptic thinking, like apocalyptic theology, which is really a different genre from what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here, what I'm talking about right now, is biblical end times, like eschatology, eschatos, like the end, having to do with the last things, and how that's been traditionally understood in the American context, but even not just America. Like I said, the UK, this used to be a prevalent thing and topic of discussion among people who take the Bible as God's word and attempt to interpret it um, the best they can. And so that's something that a lot of um, theologian type people have given up on. They're not really interested in biblical exegesis other than to find like kind of jumping off points for the dogmatic stuff that they want to talk about. Then you just get lost in the inner theologic of the text without actually ever dealing with the text at all. And that's just not my approach to things. I'm into, of course, Christian dogmatics, um, and I like thinking about eschatological realities from that vantage point. But, excuse me, there's also this other side, to me anyways, as far as the biblical studies and exegesis goes. And if we pay careful attention to the text, you can't escape this fact that in the New Testament and Old Testament, but in the New Testament especially, almost every epistle, all the Gospels, the whole book of Revelation, I mean, it's just packed with end times stuff and thinking, and 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 yet a lot of the theology type people that I know aren't interested in talking about that. So, which is unfortunate because I actually, even just like from a almost like a voyeuristic at a certain level, like a voyeuristic perspective, it's interesting for me to still talk about dispensationalism, even though I'm not a dispensationalist anymore. It was very formative for me growing up as part of my background, and so that's why, and I still see it impacts a lot of the people that I know, older people usually, or people from Calvary Chapel, or just people who are part of the evangelical subculture where this is still taught. So I know a lot of people like that still, and so that's why I still have interest in it. And I do think there is end time stuff spoken about in the scriptures in the Bible, and so it's an interesting topic to me, and it's a unique represents a unique subculture. So what I want to do, I'm going to read something I wrote. I wanted to like do a split screen thing here, but I don't think it's going to work. So let me click over to this. Hopefully this keeps recording me at least. I think it will. Yeah. So I wrote this blog post. It was really at my wife's request, and I entitled it "My Personal End Times Timeline per my wife's request." So I'm just going to work through this because it really lays out what I think about end times type stuff from a biblical perspective, and then we can just we can end this one. I can go take a nap maybe, but so let me just read a little bit here. So this post is per my wife's request. We both grew up as your typical conservative Baptist, dispensational, premillennial, pre-tribulational Christians. I've already shared my testimony out of the dispensational premill part of that more than once, so we won't revisit that now. I persuaded my wife about 10 years ago to the all-millennial position, and it has stuck. We are both committed to that position, but I have done more work on thinking a way out of the disbe past. And so my wife would like an eschatological timeline per an all-mill understanding, a very dispe way to think. So for the remainder of this post, that's what I will attempt to do. So the all-millennial timeline is quite straightforward, actually. In fact, this is one of its compelling features. I think it fits well with the spirit of what we find in Peter's second epistle when he writes, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." That's 2 Peter 3:10-13. And so I continue to write here. So Peter's timeline seems to suggest that the next event we should expect biblically, eschatologically, is the second coming of Christ. at which time all things will be dissolved and the new heavens and earth will be realized. If we are looking for the simplest explanation, so Occam's razor, about a timeline of such things, Peter's seems to be the most compelling. In the interim between the first and second advent of Christ, the amillennialist maintains that what Revelation 20 refers to, the 1,000 years, is figurative for that in-between time. There is an exegetical case for that, but we won't attempt to make that here. Suffice it to say, what Revelation does refer to, as Richard Bauckham so persuasively argues, is that the book itself should actually be understood as a circuit letter or epistle to the seven churches. If so, it makes sense to think that all of its reference, while prophetic, have a local context in mind per the original reader's milieu. Bauckham, in sum, shows how almost all the prophecies in Revelation, barring chapters 19 to 22, make the most sense when in reference to the Neronic, so Nero, Roman Empire and all of its attendant characteristics. While those prophecies have a nearer to the original audience fulfillment, what remains prophetic for us is that the power of the beast and the Antichrist are typified by every other subsequent world empires that feature the same sort of attributes that we find shaping the Greco-Roman Empire. So a power that seeks to enrich itself at all costs by military might built upon the backs of slave labor and its necessary means, human trafficking. Having noted the above, I still think there can be multiple references in mind in regard to the book of Revelation. So while there were literal fulfillments near to the original audience, those prophecies could also have a yet future fulfillment. In other words, I'm not against the idea that a literal figure known as the Antichrist, although not by a flashing sign hanging around his neck, could emerge and bring in a world peace and a utopian-like actualization that meets all of the aspirations that people have to live a healthy and wealthy life. In fact, it seems almost likely that something like that could be upon the globe even now, but who knows at the moment. I just know that at the first coming of Christ, most people missed it. There was no perfectly charted timeline, but there were signs that those with eyes to see and ears to hear could identify in relationship to the Messiah's first coming. The New Testament identifies the few who had that type of insight. As far as the so-called Great Tribulation, Matthew 24, I think more than likely we have been in that period ever since Christ ascended. See Keener's thoughts below, which we will do. I do believe, along with other millennialists, that the parts of what Jesus refers to in the Olivet Discourse were fulfilled at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That said, I do not necessarily take a so-called partial preterist position per se, just that the great tribulation that the world had never seen was fulfilled in the great destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That said, I am still open to even this having a yet future fulfillment. In other words, just as I noted in regard to the book of Revelation and its reference, I think it is possible that we could have a climaxing great tribulation just prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. This time period, I would take it, won't have a flashing sign saying, this is it. Just like the Antichrist, whether that be a single messenger or a federation of leaders with a figurehead who has a prominent speaking position, he or they won't have a blinky light overhead. This will all be just as organic as the first coming of Christ. That said, as the Apostle Paul notes in 1 Thessalonians 5, but concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. You are all sons of light and sons of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. 1 Thessalonians 5, 1-6. Verse 4 drives home the point that, like at the first coming, those with eyes to see and ears to hear or in the light shouldn't be surprised at the coming of Christ. In other words, the Apostle Paul believes that there will be certain characteristics present that the Christian ought to be able to identify, to the point that we should be able to have a general knowledge about the timing of Christ's second coming. We see Paul in context refer to the labor pains analogy that Jesus himself refers to in his teaching on the same topic. The defining feature that Paul tells the Christians to look for is a world that is characterized by the sensation of peace and safety. This does seem to correlate to the idea that the Antichrist, or in the Thessalonian context, the man of lawlessness, will usher in a time of pseudo-peace wherein the globe believes something magnificent and even miraculous has happened. Getting back to the Great Tribulation category, let me refer us to Craig Keener's helpful index for attempting to think about how the Great Tribulation and all the events referred to in Matthew 24 might play out. You'll notice that the way I describe the tribulation above fits into the sweep of what Keener describes. And out of the options that Keener describes, I am in full agreement with his personal take. So, quote, this is Keener, Craig Keener. In Matthew, the tribulation seems to begin with the sanctuary's destruction in AD 66 and concludes with Jesus' return. As I think most likely, Matthew writes some years after 70, this allows several interpretive options in Matthew 24. Jesus, number one, skips from this tribulation to the next eschatologically significant event, his return. Cross-reference Luke 21:24, especially compare Matthew 24:21, nor ever shall be with Daniel 12:1. Number two regards the whole interim between the temple's demise and his return as an extended tribulation period, so immediately. And number three prophetically blends the tribulation of 66 through 70 with a final one, which it prefigures. See Bach. So Craig Bach. And number four begins the tribulation in 66, but postpones the rest of it until the end time. And five intends his return in 29 through 31, symbolically for the fall of Jerusalem. And then further he writes, this is what he favors. I currently favor number one or two with elements of three. Against the view of a spiritual coming are the many emphatic statements about a personal visible coming in the context. See Matthew 24:27. The third option may in fact deserve more attention than my current inclination has given it. Certainly the prophetic perspective naturally viewed nearer historical events as precursors of the final events. Early Jewish texts also telescope the generations of history with the final generation, as in Mark. The tribulation of 66 to 70 remains somehow connected with the future parousia, if only as a final prerequisite. Further, the context may suggest that Jesus employs his description eschatologically, as in some Jewish end-time texts. In this case, the disasters of 66 to 73 could not have exhausted the point of his words. In any case, the view circulated mainly in current popular circles that Matthew 24 addresses only a tribulation that even readers after 70 assumed to be wholly future is not tenable. Matthew understands that all these things, probably referring to the question about the temple's demise, see Matthew 24, verse 2 and Mark 13:4, will happen within a generation, Matthew 24:34. Language throughout Jesus' teaching in Matthew refers to the generation then living. Further, Luke dispenses with much of the symbolism and lays the emphasis almost entirely on the Roman conquest of Jerusalem, in which Judean slaves were carried among the nations. For Luke, the abomination that brings about desolation becomes simply the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem, promising desolation. So here's my summary of everything I just read and what I kind of tried to lay out there. Let me attempt a timeline based on all that I have hashed out above. I believe the next event the Christians should be ready for is the second coming of Jesus Christ. I think that great tribulation has been upon the world ever since the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Just ask most of the third and developing worlds about that. But I also believe that the tribulation has been intensifying like labor pains. And at the very end, there will be a climaxing intensification of that, which will be the final iteration of the Great Tribulation Jesus referred to so long ago on the Temple Mount. In the midst of this, there will be an emerging federation, the beast, potentially with a messianic-like figurehead who, with the power of overwhelming military might and the technological enrichment that entails, among other riches, will provide a peace the world has longed for since Adam and Eve's fall in the garden. In the midst of this false sense of peace, Jesus will return. This federation, like the original Babylonians, would like to think that they have finally reached the heavens and become God himself. They will be deluded to believe. So, and I cross-reference Revelation 27 through verses 7 through 10. The battle has finally been won, but just in that moment, Jesus will return and destroy all those with the mark of the beast, i.e., people without the mark of the Lamb, by the sword of his mouth. At this moment, the great white throne judgment will occur, the new heavens and earth will come into full consummation, and we will be with Christ forevermore. Personally, I think it is possible that what the world is currently experiencing, with all of the strange chaos and tumult, could be the time I just described, but we won't know that, not really, till after the fact. That said, I think with the Apostle Paul that we ought to imagine the sons and daughters of the light, that we might have the capacity to sense just when the second coming of Christ is upon us, such that that day does not take us as a thief. If a global peace somehow comes out of the current global chaos we are experiencing, if a global federation and maybe a particularly charismatic figurehead rises up out of that, I think it highly likely that Jesus' second coming is just upon us at that point. Then again, it just might happen this very moment. We ought to watch. So, And I think that's, let me, and I, here's something I said about the mark of the beast in like a footnote to my post. I say, I take the mark of the beast to be in reference to those who were born in their sin, born into the kingdom of darkness, and never freely chose to take the mark of the Lamb. They never repented and came to Christ, being sealed with the Holy Spirit. So that's, I think that fits contextually when you look at Revelation 13 and 14 in that area when it's talking about the mark of the beast in contrast or juxtaposition to the mark of the Lamb. So I think that's a better reading than imagining that we're going to be stamped or chipped or something like that with something that we can buy and sell with. I mean, there are things happening that make you wonder if that isn't more literal than I think. But I think as far as the mark of the beast goes, um, it's something that people are aware of. So it's not something that would be like your credit card or a vaccine or something like that. It's going to be overt. And if if you think of it that way, and I don't actually anymore. I think of the mark of the beast as something as representative of anybody who has rejected the mark of the Lamb, who have not repented and come to Christ. And when you come to Christ, you shed that mark of the beast. So that's the way I see that in context, and that's following Richard Bauckham, and he has a really good little book called Theology of the Book of Revelation, which I recommend. That's kind of the book that finally pushed me over the top to become an all-millennialist rather than a historic premillennialist. Um, yeah, so I think that's something that we should consider and think about as well. But as far as the mark of the beast goes, so um, I don't really have a lot more to say right now. Like I said, I'm really tired. I probably shouldn't be doing this right now. But if you have any questions, you can post a comment. Looks like on the StreamYard app that I'm using or website, it allows you to post a comment. So if you have any questions about end times or anything like that, that might help me have something to talk about. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, but I haven't really organized. I don't have any. Again, I don't have any structure to this. It's just off the top. And I read that blog post I just read. Uh, it does kind of represent what I think, but I'm kind of like always in flux a little bit on some of this stuff too. So sometimes I'm tempted to go back to like historic premillennial position versus the all-millennial position, but it just creates a lot of problems just theologically, I think, and even biblically. Like it doesn't make a lot of sense to me anymore. The pre-mill position really, I mean, I don't know. It's just representative of someone's hermeneutic in the way that they interpret Revelation, really, and Revelation 20 in particular, in 1,000 years. And so, if you are aware of how John uses numbers, gematria, which is like a part of the Judeo-Christian prophetic um, hermeneutic, and the way that they would use numbers when they were writing about apocalyptic type events in the apocalyptic genre, they would use like multiples of 10, 7, like 3. Like we see all of those in the book of Revelation. So like when we come to the 1,000 years, for example, we do see multiples of 10 used over and over again. And so the 1,000 years falls into that. And it makes you think, based on understanding that background, about how the Jewish Christian prophetic tradition back in the day used numbers that way in figurative ways, not in literalistic ways. So that really made me rethink a lot about how that number could be using. So how that number could be being used. Like I said, I'm exhausted right now. I don't even know why I'm doing this. But But yeah, I don't have a lot more to say. I am totally rambling right now. I read that blog post, so hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight of where I'm at. I don't, as far as I guess I could talk a little bit about Israel and the Palestinian uh, skirmish, which it was more than that skirmish, but I guess I could talk a little bit about that from my perspective. Um, and I don't, like I said, dispensationalists, they look at the 1948 when Israel became a state again. They look at that as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And I don't see it that way at all. Um, when the Bible talks about Israel and the prophecy that is associated with them coming back, it doesn't look like what we see in the state of Israel right now. It doesn't look that way at all. It's associated with the reign of the Son of David, so Jesus, the Messiah. And dispensationalists always put that they put that part of it in the future still, so they take this futurist approach to interpretation, a strictly futurist approach. And so they're waiting for that's still yet to be fulfilled, but they see the nation of Israel coming back together in 1948 as a um, as part of that fulfillment. They see that as kind of like the beginning, the proto part of that fulfillment. So, and I don't. I think that it's it's referring to Revelation 21 and 22 is what all these land, like the land promises, or the land promise that God made to the people of Israel, that they'd have a land ruled by the Son of David, and or the Messiah ultimately. Um, I take that to be in reference to Revelation 21 and 22, and dispensationalists and historical premillennialists, even for that matter, take it to be in reference to a literal, uh, like like a pre-fulfillment of the ultimate fulfillment. So it's kind of like a stage one and stage two. They have two stages of in their understanding of the millennium, and I don't see that in the Bible actually, and I don't see this. I don't think it's necessary to think about um, the millennium and the eternal state. That I don't think we need to think the eternal state and the fulfillment of land promises and things like that against each other. And that's really what premillennialists in general do. They think of them in competition. They think of the eternal state versus like physical time and space against each other, as if the eternal state is some sort of ethereal reality, and other dimensional reality that doesn't really have anything to do with what the Bible is referring to prophetically. And so they need all that to be fulfilled before we get to the eternal state. But I don't. That's Platonism. That's not biblicism, and it's definitely not thinking after the analogy of the incarnation itself. And so once I started thinking about these things from a non-competitive understanding of time and eternity, when I started thinking about things from the incarnation and the analogy that that entails, as far as bringing together the hypostatic union of the eternal, so the divinity, the eternal, and time, humanity, and physicality in the humanity of Jesus Christ. When you start to think about these things that way, in non-competitive, non-dualist ways, which I think premillennialism necessarily does, you don't. It's not a problem then to think of things in terms of an amillennialist understanding. You're not thinking of like Revelation 21 and 22 in opposition to prophecies about a messianic age, or the Son of David ruling and reigning in a new Zion. You don't need this like two-stage approach to the millennium. when you think from the analogy of the incarnation, when you quit thinking of these things in competition one with the other. And so that's really what allowed me to move to amillennialism, or it even kind of forced me almost theologically to move into this amillennial way of thinking about the relationship of time and eternity and the eschaton. I don't need to have this like kind of like intermediate stage between now and the eternal state, and that intermediate state or period would be like the 1,000-year millennial period on this earth, because I think we're going to be on this earth just recreated in the eternal state, so to speak. So I think once you abandon like these Platonic ways of thinking, which is exactly what that is, or these dualist ways of thinking about time and eternity, and quit thinking about things in competitive ways vis-a-vis God and time and humanity, physicality. When you start thinking from Christ, all of that kind of melts away. And that's really what led me to amillennial understanding. And I think there's a good exegetical case for it. I think it's a simpler way to read um, the whole New Testament witness on the millennium and Revelation in particular. When you understand how there's basically three cycles that unfold in parallel with each other in kind of like a um, kind of intensifying way as we get to the very end, and that would correlate back to what Jesus taught about the birth pangs. I think that is something that is present in the book of Revelation, literarily and theologically then. And I think it really fits in much better than with an amillennial understanding of things, which if you knew me from the past, when I first got online and started blogging, I would argue tooth and nail with anybody who rejected pre-tribulational premillennialism. And now I'm on the other side of that. I've gone to the dark side, I guess. And here I am, but I'm not into, I guess here's something else I can talk about in this context. A lot of dispensationalists, especially at the popular level, will say that somebody who's an all-millennialist or post-millennialist, which I think post-millennialism has no biblical warrant to it whatsoever, but I'll leave that as an aside. But a lot of people say that these dispensationalists say that people who are all millennialists are into what's called replacement theology. So, in other words, they think that all millennialists have basically replaced the promises made to national Israel and replaced Israel, ethnic Israel, with the church. And so now all of those promises made for ethnic Israel are applicable to the church. And I don't take that approach. And you don't have to really. And so that's really like the classical revised dispensationalists think that. There are progressive dispensationalists like Craig Blazing and Bach and Darrell Bach, and they don't think that way. They think that you to the Jew first and then the Gentile. So if you follow that pattern, you don't have to make that kind of assumption that just because there's one people of God instead of two, that the promises made to Israel have now all been transferred to the church or something like that. But what I think though, according to Ephesians 2, is that there is no competition between Israel and the church either, that they are one people of God together in God's Israel, who is Jesus. I don't think the church is Israel. I think Jesus is Israel. And so all the promises made to Israel, because Israel, and this gets kind of Thomas Torrance even in his Mediation of Christ, but Israel was a prefigurement of the climax of who they were mediating to the world in the Abrahamic covenant. They prefigured kind of like a proto-incarnational or quasi-incarnational way, in a physical way, God tabernacling among humanity. And then, of course, Jesus is the fulfillment of that ultimately. And so, really, the whole point of Israel, the nation of Israel ethnically, is Jesus. And so, I see all the promises made to the nation of Israel as actualized in the person of Jesus Christ. And so, as we are brought into union with Him, we then become participants of all those promises made to Israel. And they are literal, actually. I think they're literal. They will be literally fulfilled. The things that haven't yet been fulfilled, the land promise made to Abraham, the Sinaitic covenant, hasn't fully been fulfilled yet. And that's what dispensationalists will argue too. And I don't disagree with that. They didn't fully occupy the land in Joshua or Judges, or they lived in disobedience. They didn't do what God told them to do. And so that land promise was never fully met ultimately, but it will be. And I think that's Revelation 21 and 22. So, so yeah, that's where I'm at on these things. And it's an interesting, I mean, it's an interesting discussion to have with people, because a lot of people, because there's so much kind of like consternation that surrounds this discussion, a lot of people will just ignore it. They don't worry about it, like the theologian type guys I know. They think it's kind of like an absurd discussion to have, but I mean, I don't, because I read the Bible a lot and the Bible talks about it. So I think we need to deal with it. We can't just ignore it and hide in our theology books. So that's why I like talking about it. Now, I should have waited till I was more awake to do this, but I don't know. I think I've said some interesting things here, even the rambling. And it would help if I had people watch. I don't have one person watch me. Oh, there's somebody again. But um, but yeah. And right now I have this sweatshirt on. I'm like, it's too warm now all of a sudden to have this on. So anyway, I don't know. I'm not sure about this YouTube stuff, to be honest. I think there are some YouTubers out there. I mean, doing theology on YouTube actually doesn't have the greatest reputation anyway. So, but neither does blogging necessarily among the academic theologians. You know, a lot of them look down on blogging, but I think blogging can be done in a way that's critical and even rigorous, and can engage with topics in meaningful and substantive ways. It's just that it's not regulated by peer review. But as far as YouTube goes and talking about stuff like this, it's kind of hard, especially when I'm sitting here by myself with nobody to talk to. So for me to just sit here off the top and try to talk about the millennium or on-mill, post-mill, pre-mill, I mean, I have some things to say about all that, but it's I'm not going to be on here sensationalizing what's going on with Israel and the Palestinians, for example. So a lot of this doesn't play well, you know, online, because really what works online, especially on YouTube, is kind of like sensationalistic type stuff. And I don't really think biblical prophecy, it is sensational in the right understanding of that word. I mean, it's exciting to think about that Jesus is coming again, that he's actively working in the world today. And just to know that I find comfort in that, in knowing that he's actively at work in the world and he's accomplishing his purposes in the midst of all the chaos out there. And I read that through a cruciform lens. So I read that through a theology of the cross, and that's related to eschatology. The cross is highly eschatological. And that is kind of like, so that kind of gets us back into like this theological discussion about eschatology. versus like the biblical, like prophetic kind of discussion as far as the details of the end times and things like that. But they are related too. So they're related in the sense I kind of just brought up, that there's a lot of chaotic stuff going on in the world, and that we read that chaotic stuff through the lens of the cross. And um, and the cross itself is very eschatological. In other words, it has to do with, it is the end times. It's like the initiation of the end times when Jesus came the first time. And so we live in anticipation of his second coming in light of his first coming. And we allow that reality and understanding that he is seated in heavenly places right now at the right hand of the Father. And he's constantly inbreaking into our lives and in this world. And he's working in this world. So Jesus, there is this parousia, this presencing in his coming that will be the ultimate climax, will be when he comes again bodily. But he comes every day, personally, in our lives, and even collectively in the church. He's working. And that has to do with eschatology. That is his eschatological life. He is the eschatos of God. He is the last things of God. For us, he is the alpha and omega of God. And so when we start thinking about eschatological things, the best frame to do that from is, to think from Jesus. And that's, of course, I'm committed to that slavishly, to that principle and reality, that personal reality in Christ, that we're going to think all of these things through Christ rather than through kind of like abstract things and current events that we're watching unfold and things like that. And it's not that we can't look at these current events and think, oh man, it does seem like things can't go on much longer like this. It's just biblically, like we look at the Old Testament and how things worked. We look at Sodom and Gomorrah and how God acted there, and the flood before that. And so we know that there is a time when God's going to say, that's it. That's enough. No more of this. And he will usher in the very end. But the very end is the very beginning in Christ. And so that is how okay, my tiredness is really catching up to me. Eschatology impacts our present lives right now every day. So we experience crises personally in our lives, and we see Jesus break into our lives and rescue us, relieve us, bring refreshment. Sometimes it takes a while, or he doesn't do it the way we would hope he would. But again, so there is an interrelationship between biblical thinking about prophecy and end times type stuff, and then how that interrelates with theological realities as far as the cross, the resurrection, the ascension. And I find that almost more interesting and more exciting, and not very sensational to think about that Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father right now. We are seated there with him in his intercessory work, always, and he's always living to make intercession for those who will inherit eternal life. So that's eschatological. That has to do with end time things in the present. That's sensational to me. That's exciting to think about to me. So I think when I think about end times, it always comes back to Jesus rather than a nation of Israel. Not that the nation of Israel isn't important in God's economy, but I don't see what I see. Here's what I think about the nation of Israel in the 1948 thing. I see I see God in that, in his providential hand, and I see him ministering to the covenant people of Israel, the people whom he mediated his Messiah through to bring salvation to the nations. So I see him showing them some favor, especially after they endured what they did in the Holocaust, or the Shoah, the catastrophe that Hitler perpetrated upon them as a people in Germany. And not just them though either. There was he killed like 20 million people, his own people, handicapped people, the unwanted in society. He slaughtered them too. But there was a particular focus. His solution was to wipe out the Jewish race and people. And so I do see God's mercy in providing a nation for them to flee to and to get out of Germany and Western Europe in general and other countries. And so I see God's hand of mercy in the establishment of the state of Israel, but I don't see it as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. I see um, his hand in that, and I see there's a hope for just an illustration of how he brings hope for his people, and we look still yet forward to this fulfillment, um, where the Son of David will rule and reign once and for all on this earth. And I believe that's fulfilled in Revelation 21 and 22, and not in some interim millennial period. I believe we're in this in between time between the first and second advents of Christ is referring that the millennial period refers to that period of time and not some yet future 1,000 years. That doesn't make any sense to me anymore. So that's where I'm at on these things. I'm probably going to end this now. I'm going to take a nap and eat dinner pretty soon, I think, too. But I'm probably going to delete this one. I didn't get any viewers, really. No questions. That's okay. So, okay, I'm done. Bye.